Hello and welcome to Call of Discovery, the podcast where we invite you on a journey into the Crucible for a weekly, or no, it's not weekly anymore. KeyForge is on hiatus. It's fortnightly celebration of all things KeyForge, its wonderful community, and of course the excitement of discovery. I am still somehow here as your co-host 2.5 years later, and I am joined, as always, by the Archon across the sea, Zach Armstrong. How are you doing, sir?
Oh, am I being knighted? Is it finally happening?
You're an Archon, and I'm British. Therefore, if you heard my voice, I can knight anyone I want.
Brilliant. Sir Zach the Archon doth very well over here. Thank ye, sir.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. I'm sorry, I don't speak whatever language you were aiming for there, Zach. But and we are joined today by Simon Finchley. Good to meet you, Simon. How are you doing?
I am great. I'm just having a blast because I'm a fan of the podcast, and so to hear your voices and to talk to you is just such a treat. So I am just on cloud nine over here. This is a blast.
Well, I'm very much glad you like the podcast. We're yet to have someone on here that says, do you know what? Actually, I don't like the podcast, but I just thought I'd come on anyway.
Just thought I'd show up.
And to that person, I tip my cap and say, touche.
So the reason we've got Simon on today is Simon is an author in the wonderful genre of science fantasy. And listener, if you're saying, what? Science fantasy? This is a KeyForge podcast. Then let me tell you, listener, KeyForge is so science fantasy that it's just amazing. It's science, it's fantasy, and Simon's going to be able to say that a lot better than I am as we dive into the topic here. It's just combining science fiction elements with fantasy elements, combining all of that with Amber, and then of course there's a game on top of it. So we're going to talk about how all that works and actually why it works. As I've stated before on the podcast, when I first saw the world of the Crucible, I said, well, that's completely crazy, and I guess just there so they can make a game on top of it. But the more I spend time in it, the more I kind of adore it, and it really does work in a cohesive fashion. But before that, Ed, I think we like to talk about our host as a people person, don't we?
A people person? We have people on? Gosh.
I am absolutely a people person, whatever that is.
Oh, yeah, I forgot to ask if you were Svar or giant or tree.
No. Human, 100% human. Definitely.
All right.
That's what you say, at least. We
yes.
can't necessarily believe you, but
yeah. Watch out for those sacrificial altars and Quicklist Plague Masters. Those will get you.
Well, as long as you're not a Martian, that's absolutely fine by me. So, Simon, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you discover KeyForge?
Well, I've always been a fan of board games and tabletop games. I've collected them for years and years. And I think the first collectible game that I ever played was the Star Wars CCG from the Decipher, late 90s, early 2000s, which in retrospect was probably a poor introduction to collectible card games because it is very complicated. But I was like 11 or 12 and I loved Star Wars, and there was this game and it had cards, and I just love the idea of all, the possibilities of all these cards interacting was something that really enticed me into it. And then, years later, I'm playing Hearthstone and one of the digital implementations of Magic, and I'm playing another digital card game called Eternal. And these are the games that really I sunk into the collectible aspect of these games. But what I came up against was, for all of these possibilities, for all of these cards, the general consensus was there was only a handful of decks that were viable, right, in the meta, right? You've got to play one of these, 3 or 4 or 5 decks to be competitive. And even if you didn't want to play those decks, those were the only decks you were going to see, right? Because that's all anybody else played. And so that was kind of disappointing, to have all this possibility, but then it all get whittled down into this very, restrained experience. So when I first heard about KeyForge, and I think this was summer 2018, so like 6 months before it even released.
Mm-hmm.
I heard about KeyForge, this game designed by Richard Garfield with generated decks that you can't modify. I immediately understood what that meant, right? It's like, oh, like you have to just deal with these cards, right? And nobody's gonna be able to craft the perfect deck, and no matter who you play against, it's gonna be this totally unique experience. And so I pre-ordered the starter set based on the strength of that announcement. I was like, all right, I will try it. And then we'll see if it's actually fun to play, because my gimmick meter kind of went off a little bit. I was like, well,
Sure.
I mean, I'm enticed by your thing, but how does it play is always my question. Is it actually fun? And I get the starter set and I play it, and there's a learning curve, but eventually I start to catch on, and oh boy, is it fun. It is a blast. I think I went to like a release event. For the very first set, there were so many people there. It was probably it was massive. I think I lost every single game, and I still had a blast. And that was what hooked me. Was like, if I'm having this much fun losing, like this is the game for me, because I'll probably lose a lot. So.
That's a really good sign, isn't it? When you lose, but you still enjoy it. And there are times in KeyForge where that's not true, but most of the time that is true.
Yeah, indeed. And you've come to the right podcast if you lost a bunch and still loved the game. That's definitely the right podcast.
What do you mean, Zach? We're all really competitive here. I'm known in the community for my aggressive, competitive nature and my many, many Vault Tour wins.
Yeah, you're our solid 3-3 Vault Tour Call of Discovery record. Yeah, if you want to win, go listen to Wookiee and the KFBL guys on Archon's Corner now. That's where to go for that. That's great to hear about getting into the game, Simon. That's I think how a lot of us did that announcement. I certainly had to read it a bunch of times before I had any idea what the heck they were trying to tell me in this blog post. And so I know from a blog you've put up that when you saw the art on the aforementioned starter set that you pre-ordered, you went, "Oh, this is science fantasy." So
Yes.
could you tell us just in like a nutshell what is science fantasy itself, and what told you that KeyForge was science fantasy?
So science fantasy, or at least how the term is used now, means any work of media that uses tropes from both science fiction and fantasy. Now, the term itself, it goes back to the very, very early days of science fiction, when it was used to differentiate what was called hard science fiction, science fiction that is using the science of the day and extrapolating forward, versus things like what might be called planetary romance, things like John Carter of Mars or Flash Gordon. These things were called science fantasy in a sort of a derogatory way, to say, oh, that's not real science fiction. That's lesser than somehow. The term has been making a resurgence, and I think being embraced a lot in this new way, in thinking about the mixture of these two tent poles of speculative fiction coming together and making something totally new. So, as you said, when I saw the artwork, I was the first thing you notice. There's a lot going on, right? It's a very diverse world. You can see there's all sorts of different kinds of creatures of different sizes. You see that it's a really bright and fun and fantastical world, and then and then there's robots, and then there's these mechanical arms, and there's all these other things that you don't quite know what they are. But then there's also this like spirit angel thing. And just from those elements alone, you could say, wow, this is science fantasy. This is a mashup world. This is something that's really exciting.
I had the same reaction when I saw the box art, with the mix of mixing a lot of known tropes, but turning them, just 15 degrees to the right or the left to make them different. And yeah, I think it just works for KeyForge, especially keeping the fiction open for them to do whatever they want to with in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the big advantage, right? It's very hard to think of something that they could introduce into the Crucible that would feel out of place, right? They have a lot of territory and flexibility with that. Having said that, there might be some like tonal things that they could misstep on. It is it's a bright world. It's a fun world. It's a wacky world. And I think if they went too like dark, that would start to feel a little strange. But other than that, they've got a lot of playing space that they can expand into, which is also super exciting.
I think when I first discovered the KeyForge theme, it was almost too whimsical for me, and I felt a bit jarred by it. But now I embrace it, and maybe it's because the world around us has got a little bit darker in the last few years, and we kind of need it as an escape. But it is pretty special and pretty unique. And Zach mentioned the cyberpunk implants in Brobnar. I think there's a myriad of different things that you could pick out. Roman dinosaurs, for instance. Where the hell did that come from? It's amazing. Just KeyForge is unique in so many levels. And on that one, Simon, what's your most memorable experience playing KeyForge? Maybe it was the time that the game really clicked for you.
Oh my goodness. I was playing, I think it was just like a regular chainbound, and I had a deck, and it had Dis and Mars. Sorry, Ed. And and I had a Snudge on the table, and I had the brainstem antenna from Mars, which says, after you play a Mars creature, ready this creature and treat it as if it belongs to Mars. And so I put the brainstem antenna. I don't know why. There was some sort of circumstance, because I had never done this before, but I put the brainstem antenna on the Snudge. And then I played a Mars creature from my hand, which readied the Snudge. And Snudge says, reap. You can return a flank creature to its owner's hand. And so I reap with the Snudge, and then I'm like, wait, I can send that Mars creature back to my hand, and then I can play it again, and that'll ready the Snudge. And I can do that 6 times, and I hit the rule of 6, just like in casual play, just for something that I had not seen yet before. And that was the moment where I was like, there's just, I had been playing with this deck for a while, and there was still these new things and this amazing combo that I had never seen before. And it just leads you to wonder, like, what else is there? What else? How much more can I get out of this deck? I remember that moment so specifically, with that combo. That was a lot of fun.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And what a fun combo to discover, right? That is the moment of the jungle, right? To use
absolutely
Richard Garfield's analogy, that wasn't an amusement park where a designer in a back room at some point had said, okay. And then after a couple plays, they'll see this synergy between Brainstem Antenna and Snudge. Honestly, when they made Brainstem Antenna, I'm sure they didn't go through every creature and say, here's how it'll work with every creature. They just said, well, we've got the rule of 6, so we'll be okay.
Right.
And while you were talking about that, I got so excited. And I have discovered that as of recording, there are 11 decks on Decks of KeyForge for sale with Brainstem Antenna and Snudge.
Ooh.
And the highest rated one by SAS is only $22.
Hey, that's not too bad. And then on top of that deck that I have has 2 crystal hives.
Oh.
So if you can hit that with 2 of your crystal hives activated, that's 18 amber right there. It's
amazing.
Totally nuts. It's one of those like, well, if and it never happens, but it could happen.
Right. You just need to get somebody to leave a Snudge alive for a turn, which people are getting wiser and wiser to these days.
You can't snudge them out of that one then.
I'm only laughing because I'm confused.
It's like, oh, that's funny. Wait, what does he mean?
I think he's snudging us, Simon.
Oh, okay.
Try and get your brainstem antennae out, and it might show you it might help you understand.
Did you just accuse me of being Martian, Ed?
But I don't like Martians.
Oh no!
Only now do you find out that Zach is a Martian. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had a filter on every time we've actually met via video to phase out my green skin.
Well, Martians make bad podcast hosts, right?
Yeah, yep, that's the card. That's the card. Oh,
And Zach is known
amazing.
for his generosity.
Mm.
Oh, wow. Wow.
I can do
Oh
this
my
all
gosh.
day.
Yeah. Yeah.
But let's
Oh,
not.
jeez. Yeah. Let's save ourselves from Ed here. What so we've talked about what science fantasy is, right? And kind of what the basic traits of KeyForge are that fit within this very cool kind of genre, this combination that takes from multiple traditions, bringing it into one new thing. So, Simon, as both a science fantasy author yourself and a player of KeyForge, and whether it's gameplay or in the fiction, what does KeyForge being inside of science fantasy allow the creators and writers of the game to do that maybe other games might not accomplish?
Right. That's a great question. I think when I first started playing the game and getting to know the different factions and stuff, it was really clear to me that this was a game that had been designed first, and then they were putting a world on top of it to fit the game, right?
Yes.
Like,
Yep.
it seemed pretty clear that, at least from what we had available at the time in terms of lore, which was just the couple pages in the rule book for the factions, it was like, this is a pretty thin justification for what's going on. But there's something about it that grows on you. I think that you've talked about, Ed, right? Or Zach, where it's so bright and charming that it sort of doesn't matter, right? This idea that there's all these different factions in the same place. Okay, so how are we going to justify that? Well, it's they just show up on this immense world. Okay, well, how do we make sure that there's always going to be room for more? Well, it's massive, right? And how do new things show up? Well, they just show up sometimes, right? Out of nowhere. Okay, great. Right. But then when you think about that, and then they're all in this place and they're all mixing together, it all these possibilities open up, right? And I think Star Alliance is such a great example of this. There's this idea that they've crash landed, they have this organization, they have this structure that now has to adapt to this infinite world, right? And what does that mean? And they start recruiting people into their organizations, and we see that on the cards, right? We see elves being recruited into the Star Alliance, and spirits and Aquans, and I feel like that really encapsulates this idea of all of these possibilities, and then the ways that they interact with each other and mix together. I don't know if that answers your question. I forgot what the question was, but I got excited about Star Alliance.
It's always okay to get excited about Star Alliance.
Yes, they're not Mars. In fact, they're the opposites.
They really are. They really are. But yeah, the topic or the question was like, what does science fantasy allow KeyForge to do? I think you answered that pretty directly with, well, the blunt answer that ends up actually working down the line, right, is it allows them to keep expanding the game and adding new houses and exploring new things, because they just say, well, the Crucible is so huge that that like we can never know it all. So anytime they bring in a new house, like, they don't have to retcon anything, because the world we're inside of KeyForge is just so vast that the new house was there the whole time. We just found it right now.
Yes. And then so you look at something like Magic, which is all sort of in this general fantasy realm, and they've done some kind of variations on that. There, there's like a Greek mythology one kind of based, and some other kind of variations. But if you were to take like Martians and put them into Magic the Gathering, that would feel super out of place, right?
Oh yeah, or like The Walking Dead or something. Yeah.
Or Warhammer 40k next year.
Right, and I understand that they
Or
actually
Fortnite.
are doing this now, which is so.
Right,
and
right.
I think people have opinions about this, but like KeyForge, right? It's already set up, right?
Yeah, you could
they're-
genuinely do that, and it
Yeah.
wouldn't miss a stride.
No.
Yeah. And I will say that, one of the strengths of, like you were talking about, the planes, the different, planes of being, the lands all across Magic the Gathering, they've done very well with characters and storylines and tying all of that together, right? And I believe there's a recent set in essentially their Hogwarts, Strixhaven, where it was all themed on magical school, which is all
Okay.
very cool. And I do dream of KeyForge going to those places, and Daniel Levitt Clark, one of the writers and kind of world builders for KeyForge, tweeted a long time ago. He said, "Hey, just like know that the storytelling in KeyForge is only like barely getting started, right? We have a little bit with Mass Mutation. Dark Tidings was really kind of a locale and a feel rather than plot. But FFG have tied events and story into big releases before. They did it with Netrunner. They did it, of course, with Arkham, just dripping with theme. So I'm confident they have the chops, and at some point we'll be diving into a bit more narrative.
Oh, that's so exciting.
Yeah.
It's cool to think about what places they could go, because we don't have any like straight up like bearded wizards. Like that would be really cool. I mean, it just who knows they could throw anything at us. So.
Yeah. And I will say, for anybody who hasn't read the 6 pieces of short fiction by Nate French and Daniel Levitt Clark that FFG published around the game's launch, I'd recommend going to read those. There is one that gives the story behind Duma the Martyr, because she is Squire Duma in the story, and that's all I'll say. But it was a story written around Duma the Martyr, and I would be so sad if we didn't get some next form of Duma connected to this story later down the line in Sanctum. Yeah. Oh, and okay, one more thought that, like, I've never had a place to say this, but Simon, you're the perfect person to ask this question.
Say it.
Are the architects supervillains? Because they just keep stealing everybody's planet and then just like hot gluing it to their giant planet in the center.
Well,
like,
so that's
what's going on?
So we don't know. Like, we have no sense of like what their motives might be, right?
Right.
We know that they are taking civilizations and cultures from across the known universe, or perhaps multiverse, we don't know for sure, and smashing them all together, and they can't escape. But we don't know why they're doing this. Is it an experiment? Is it a game? Is it some sort of test? And so that would determine that. Is the Crucible actually like a sanctuary for civilizations that were on the brink of destruction? Are they safe? Is this a preserve? Have they taken the Saurian Republic and the Martian civilizations and put them here to preserve them? Because otherwise they would have gone extinct. Like, we don't know. Like, and there's no really answer to that.
And has anyone even seen the architects before? Do they know?
Right.
There's no fiction so far. No, I think.
Right. I mean, in the I'm only partway through the novel, but there is some mention of the architects, so I don't know how far that gets in the Cubit Zirconium. But yeah, they seem to be as mysterious as the Archons are. Right. There's this extra level of mystery as the architects. Right. Who knows what they're doing, which is good. Right. Because it keeps it flexible. Right. As soon as there's some decision that say, okay, the architects are doing this, now that locks everything in, right?
Right.
The longer they can keep it vague, the more flexibility that they have in order to add more things to the game world.
Schrodinger's architect.
Exactly.
Yes.
And this is something
inside the box.
Schrodinger's
Maybe it's just
device.
the deck building algorithm. Too soon.
So this is something that, like, if KeyForge were a film franchise or a series of novels, this is the kind of thing that would be really, really frustrating, because it would just feel like the creators were just sort of waving their hand and being like, well, we don't know, like, what do you think? But for a game world, because it's something that people interact with, and it's going to continue to grow over time, these sort of like blank spaces, I think, are actually really, really helpful. To kind of leave things open-ended, especially for something like a role-playing game, right? You give space for the players to make discoveries on their own. There could be a session of a group of people playing the KeyForge RPG out there who they're getting to come up with this stuff. They're getting to discover this stuff and take ownership of this world, which in a way that doesn't work for other kinds of more structured narrative media.
So to summarize, the polar bear has to mean something.
Okay. Touche.
I feel like I thought that was maybe too niche, but clearly it landed. So I'm gonna take
quite.
it.
Yeah.
I thought it might be lost on you guys.
Oh, wow.
But see, that is the thing, right? Because they didn't know. They, like, the writers of Lost, like, specifically said they didn't have a plan. And I think as you get into the later seasons, that becomes very, very evident that they didn't have a plan, which is really unsatisfying for serialized television
and their future careers. But no, I completely agree. And there's another aspect of KeyForge which is intrinsic to the game itself and the world in which the game is part. And that is Amber. So,
yes.
For you, Simon, what are really the properties of Amber, and how does its design help create the world and help keep that world in tandem with that game we love?
Right. So I talk a little bit about this in the article that I wrote. But Amber exists, again, in this ambiguous space, right? It's not really defined. We know it's a substance. We know it's kind of golden in color sometimes, right? Sometimes it turns blue, and sometimes it might turn other colors. But it's deliberately described as mysterious, right? And that, because they don't define what it is or limit its power anyway, that gives it flexibility to slot into a whole bunch of different genres, right? So because it's mysterious, right, it can be something scientifical, right? The Logos robots are studying it. It's powering the Martian spaceships. But then also, because it's mysterious, it's magical, right? The witches of the Untamed are using it to power their spells, and the demons of Dis are using it to capture emotions and then eat them somehow, right? Any sort of definition or limitation on what Amber is would make one or the other side feel ridiculous. So by keeping it vague and deliberately calling it mysterious, they give it flexibility and able to interact with all of the factions, which is important, right? Because then each of the factions has a reason to be interacting with Amber, which, as we know, is the central resource of the game. And I mentioned this in the article, but I think that's just a brilliant part of the design, where this game that is revolving around collecting this substance and then expanding the lore out and saying, okay, this substance is central to everything that happens in this world, is so brilliant, because it just reinforces itself, right? Oh, I understand why I need Amber in this game, because I'm collecting it, right? And to win. So it makes sense why all these characters and creatures in this world would want to collect it. And it creates an immediate connection from the player into the game world.
Yeah, something you said there really resonated with me, because I hadn't put words to it myself before, but each house having their reason they interact with Amber, and because Amber itself is a bit like the Architects in that we just know it's powerful, right? It's powerful. It can power things. It can capture emotions. It can do any number of things, really, from be a Logos battery to, like with Rise of the Key Raken, the little fiction of why the Key Raken has arisen is because it was it was absorbing amber at the bottom of the sea for tens of thousands of years. And so that's why it's so powerful, is because it just sat on top of a giant pile of amber for all that time. And now it's super powered. Like it can do anything and be kind of the instigator of any of like any narrative that needs it.
Which sort of gives a cohesiveness to the world, right? Because then there's a single justification for any story that you want to tell in that world. Why is this happening? Amber. What is this happening? Well, amber. Which if you had to come up with separate explanations for every single thing, because every substance works in a different way, right? Then the world starts to lose its cohesiveness, or it starts to feel complicated, and it starts to feel, a little bit more. I don't know. You have to think a little bit harder, but this way they can make it do anything, right? So they can tell any kind of the story, and it will still all feel connected, and it will still all feel as part of the same world.
Yeah. And one of our Patreon members, Disciple V1, talked about, when we were preparing for this episode, talked about dark amber, and was wondering about like what might there be other types of amber, because we know that dark amber caused mutations and it was the cause for mutants, but so there's in one kind of amber, and could there be other kinds of amber? Could there be bright amber? Who knows?
I mean, they can do yes is the answer. They can do whatever they want, and to yes is the answer.
Unless they explain the polar bear, in which case it has to remain a polar bear.
Right. If they say amber comes from the amber walrus, and when the amber walrus eats broccoli, then the amber comes out of its mouth, and that's where it comes from. You're like, oh, okay, well, I wish you hadn't told me that, because that's horrible.
I feel like people would have other issues with that.
Well, now when we have some sort of snow or mountain themed set, I really need Untamed to have an amber walrus where its tusks are amber.
Ooh.
How cool would that be?
That would be very cool.
Yeah.
This white cold amber, right?
Yeah.
Oh, so that leads to another thing of when you leave it vague, whatever the answer to that mystery is that the audience comes up with in their mind is always going to be 10 times better than anything you can come up with, right? So you leave it vague,
Sure.
You let them come up with their, fan theories, and then you just let them think that, right? And then they feel invested, right? They're co-creating with you, and they get buy-in. So that's another thing that the ambiguity allows.
Yeah, and with so the architects and Amber are ambiguous, right? But of course, the entire point of KeyForge, we're forging keys to open vaults, and I feel like we might have even less information on what architects find inside of vaults. What have I found inside of vaults? With all the vaults I've won going 3-3 at Vault Tours.
Well, Zach,
what treasures are there?
Zach, have you ever been to a Chainbound?
I have been to a Chainbound.
And have you won a game at a Chainbound?
I have won a few games at Chainbound.
What did you get?
I got amber shards.
You got an amber shard.
Yeah.
That's what's in the vaults.
Oh.
See, you win the game, you open it up, and you get an amber shard. Ta-da! So they say, right, the Archons are trying to open these vaults, and but what's in each vault is different, right? So they sort of leave it open. So if you're opening a Chainbound vault, right, you get an amber shard. If you go to a vault tour and you win one of those, then you can get a T-shirt or something, right? That's what's in the vault. But then then they can expand from out. If they need a story element, right? There's something critical in one particular vault, then they can do that, right? It's flexible, right? But it's also something that the players can participate in. I can go to a vault tour, I can win games, and I can get stuff. That's the game delivers on its promise.
A side note, old Bruno runs a YouTube channel called Alpha Investments.
You're Ed, I'm gonna have to get you a stepladder if you want to punch up that high again. Let me
Sorry, I'm in a bit of a sassy mood. You may have noticed. So Simon, how do the identity of the houses interact with known tropes, but also put a spin on them using that thing we all know and love called amber?
Right. So I think the two best examples, we've already mentioned one, Brobnar, right, which takes giants, which is a fantasy, very common fantasy race, and goblins, same thing, and puts I would call it steampunk. Put steampunk armaments on them, right? Because they've got lots of vents, they've got lots of pistons, right? So it's taking this fantasy trope and giving it a science fiction-y twist with a specific genre, right? And then the other example I would draw attention to would be the shadows, right? You've got elves, right? Again, very common in lots of fantasy works. These ones are these are kind of the smaller trickster elves as opposed to elves that you find in Tolkien, right? The tall sort of, long flowing hair, living forever kind of elves. This is different. These are the small trickster elves, but these are cyberpunk elves, right? And we know that because they live in urban environments. There's lots of pipes and there's lots of neon, and they have these ways of, they're stealing a lot, which gives this vibe of like, sticking it to the man, like a cyberpunk hacker, right? So elves, fantasy, but now we're twisting it and putting it into cyberpunk. So those are the two clearest examples, I think, because those are in my mind are sort of right in the middle of the science fantasy spectrum, where the other houses sort of tend to lean further into one direction or the other.
Yeah, certainly, and I think for every house, there's just that they did really well with that twist of, okay, let's take a trope that we're basing it on, like you mentioned, right? Like elves, okay. Well, even shadows, like thieving cyberpunk elves. I feel like shadows has gone maybe even more down their own path than, say, Brobnar. And even though Brobnar I love their identity, is giants and goblins with cyberpunk. And Sanctum, of course, is knights and kind of knights Templar, that sort of thing. But with spirits and a couple other tweaks as well. But
right. Oh, and like bizarre, there's like two motorcycles in Sanctum. I call this out in the article, but like that was just so weird to me to find there's this motorcycle on Horsemen of War and there's a motorcycle on Mighty Lance.
That's right.
It's like somebody on the Sanctum art design thing is like a motorcycle fan, and it's just like, all right, we'll just throw these in.
Yeah, an amber spirit cycle.
So I have to say, while we're talking about specific factions, probably my favorite science fantasy thing in the game is the Fairies. So this idea that there are these untamed wilds, right? There's all this nature and there's all these like wild beasts, but like also there are like these tiny little robots that live out there, like, and sort of have their own ecology and their own thing. This idea that maybe some inventor at some point invented these tiny little robots and now they've self-propagated and now live out in the middle of nowhere, right? I love those fairies. So fun.
I also love that imagination. That's very cool. And you must have enjoyed the short story in Tales of the Crucible about the fairy.
Oh, which one was that?
The healing one set in the forest with
yes, I did love that one.
Corruption theme and such a special story.
Yeah. And man, all the houses have those interesting things to find, right? Like the demons of Dis are like have orbs and like bulbs of amber and ribbons. That's the other thing, is that like ribbons are somehow like a core visual identifier of demons and KeyForge, and it works. Like you only notice it once you really start looking at the art.
Right. I think I talk about this. I think I called them out specifically in the article because when at least when I first started seeing them, I was like, what are these things? Like, I've never seen anything like this. They're pink, they're black, they have spikes and, like you said, tendrils and ribbons. And as they are immediately identifiable once you get to know them. You're like, oh yeah, absolutely, that's a demon. But there's no, I at least don't have any sort of precursor to like sort of like, oh, they're kind of borrowing from this. I don't know where they came up with this. And then you read in the lore and you find out they're actually like robots. They're like all cyborg robots, and you're like, that's just weird. So yes, call out to Disc for being super strange and super cool.
Well, glory be to Mars. And Simon, thank you so much for coming out onto the podcast today. We were just really excited to talk about just the world of KeyForge and dig using your expertise as someone who's written in this world to really talk about KeyForge and really get excited about science fantasy and all that means for KeyForge and all that it can mean with and like how we said, we were FFG. If anybody from FFG listens, especially the writing team, props to you for this world, because all of us were like, oh, that's a bit of a kitchen sink, and then we're like, this kitchen sink has the best things in it. This is the loveliest kitchen sink I've ever seen. So. So thank you so much for coming on today. And I know you do have a book set in a science fantasy world, the doomed world of Milagro. So where can people find you, and what is your pitch for the book in case people want to dive into more science fantasy?
Great. Well, my pitch for the book is, if you enjoy the KeyForge lore, you will definitely enjoy the doomed world of Milagro. It's the same kind of mashup world. We've got pirates, robots, magic, giant creatures all smashed in to the same world, and there's even more beyond that. So if that's your thing, if that's what you like, you can go to simonfinchley.com. That's FINCHLEY.com, and that link will take you to the front page, and you can find my book on Amazon, where it's available in ebook and paperback.
Awesome. Well, listener, thank you so much for jumping in and joining us as we talk about the weird and wonderful world of the Crucible, alongside author Simon Finchley, talking about science fantasy. Simon Finchley, SF. It all just makes sense. He was born for it. He was born for it. And if you are enjoying Call of Discovery, please make sure you're subscribed on your podcast app of choice so that you can hear us as soon as we're out every other Thursday. And if you're new to KeyForge, please visit the new player guide on Archon Arcana, the KeyForge wiki. We've got that linked below, and you can get started on your own unique journey into this wonderful game with all the sorts of resources you'll find there. If you're looking to support Call of Discovery monetarily, please visit our Patreon linked below, and you can sign up to support us monthly there and enjoy rewards like our exclusive discourse, where we get some things, some ideas and questions for the show like we did today, as well as listening to Beyond Discovery, our Patreon only behind the scenes podcast where Ed and I get truly ridiculous. Let us know what you'd like to see more or less of in future shows by interacting with us across all of social media on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, or send us an email at podcast@calldiscovery.com. But most importantly, if you think a friend would enjoy this podcast, please help them to discover it. Have you answered the call of discovery?